January 1945. A thin line of snow lies across the fields outside a newly established American POW camp near Eupen, Belgium. The night has been quiet, too quiet for men who have spent months under artillery fire. But the morning brings an unfamiliar sound, the low rumble of U.S. Army supply trucks pushing through the frost-covered mud. Dozens of German prisoners, many captured only days earlier during the retreat from the Ardennes, stand behind the wire in silence. Their uniforms are torn, their faces hollow. They brace themselves for what they assume will be a morning of sparse rations. Dark bread if they are lucky, watered soup if the guards have enough to spare. Instead, they watch in confusion as American cooks swing open the back of the truck. Wooden crates marked U.S. Army ration, Type B, are lowered to the ground. Another stack follows, cans of meat, tins of fruit, sacks of flour, drums of hot coffee carried from a mobile kitchen already steaming in the icy air. One prisoner quietly mutters that even frontline German troops hadn't seen this much food in months. And as the Americans begin preparing meals, not for themselves, but for the prisoners, many Germans realize they are witnessing something that challenges everything they believed about their enemy. The explanation begins long before this bitter winter morning. To understand why German prisoners of war received food that astonished them, we must step back from the cold mornings of 1945 and look at the enormous machinery that powered the American war effort. The scene at Eupen did not happen by accident. It was the product of an industrial and logistical system unlike anything Germany, or any Axis nation, could sustain by the mid-war years. When the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, it possessed two resources that would shape every battlefield: agricultural abundance and industrial scale. By 1943, American farms were producing more than half of all food consumed by the Allies worldwide. Wheat harvests rose. Corn output surged. Cattle, pork, dairy, and poultry production expanded despite millions of young men leaving for military service. Mechanized farming, coupled with a largely untouched homeland, allowed the United States to wage war without starving its own people or its prisoners. At the same time, the U.S. Quartermaster Corps was transforming distribution into an exact science. From factories in Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, and Baltimore came thousands of tons of standardized rations. Type K for frontline infantry, Type C for field operations, and the more substantial Type A and Type B for fixed camps and rear installations. These were not luxury meals, but they were stable, predictable, and produced in quantities the Axis could not fathom. By 1944, the United States was manufacturing so much food for military consumption that even Allied nations recovering from devastation depended on American supply lines. Germany's situation was the opposite. Years of rationing had strained civilian life as early as 1940. By 1942, food shortages were routine. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was receiving reduced daily calories, and soldiers fresh from the Ardennes often arrived at POW camps visibly malnourished. Bread was stretched with fillers. Meat was scarce. Vegetables were seasonal. The German ration system was collapsing under the combined weight of Allied bombing, territory loss, and overstretched transportation networks. This divergence set the stage for one of the quietest, yet most revealing contrasts of the war. According to the 1929 Geneva Convention, signed by both Germany and the United States, captured soldiers were entitled to food equal in quantity and quality to that of the detaining power's own troops. The Americans, unlike many nations, took this obligation seriously, not simply for legal reasons, but because the U.S. Army believed humane treatment helped maintain discipline, reduce escapes, and weaken enemy morale. It also reflected a broader cultural attitude that prisoners, once disarmed, were no longer combatants, but human beings under American responsibility. In practice, this adherence to international law created an unusual situation. German POWs in American custody often received more consistent and higher-calorie meals than U.S. troops fighting on the front lines. Frontline soldiers depended on K rations, cold canned meals, or whatever they could heat over a small fire. Prisoners, by contrast, were fed from large camp kitchens capable of producing balanced hot meals, because the supply depots behind the lines were rarely short on ingredients. This disparity grew even more visible during the Battle of the Bulge. As American units fought through snow, lost supply routes, and struggled with frozen ration cans, the camps farther west still had reliable deliveries of bread, beans, meat, and fruit. Supply officers diverted resources to maintain order in POW facilities, knowing that neglect could spark unrest or disease outbreaks. For German prisoners accustomed to scarcity, especially those captured late in the war, the sight of overflowing American kitchens was more shocking than the barbed wire itself. Reports from U.S. Army's Inspector General noted repeated cases of German POWs expressing disbelief that their captors received no extra allowance while they, the defeated, were guaranteed regulated meals. Even in camps built hastily after major offensives, such as the ones established after the Normandy breakout or during the Rhineland advances, the pattern remained the same. Temporary shortages were resolved quickly. Food quality stayed stable. And American guards themselves often remarked on the strange dynamic of eating cold field rations while the men they guarded received a hot stew from a well-stocked kitchen. This contrast, so quiet, so subtle, was not mere generosity. It was the outward face of a logistical empire that shaped everything the United States touched during the war. From the Red Ball Express roaring across France to rail depots in Antwerp, Cherbourg, and Marseille, American supply efficiency became a strategic weapon. And this is where the story deepens, because the Germans' astonishment did not come simply from the quantity of food. It came from a realization that America could afford to feed prisoners, even while fighting a massive continental war. Their reaction was not just hunger. It was disbelief at the scale of the system behind the wire. For many German prisoners, their expectations of captivity were shaped long before they faced American guards. Propaganda inside the Reich portrayed Allied treatment as brutal, careless, or openly vindictive. Stories circulated of mistreated prisoners, starvation camps, and foreign armies indifferent to the fate of captives. These narratives were designed to harden resolve and discourage surrender. Yet by 1944, reality was diverging sharply from a message. Most German soldiers had grown up in a system where POW treatment varied widely, depending on location and circumstance. The Wehrmacht itself often struggled to feed its own camps, especially on the Eastern Front. Allied captives in German hands frequently received rations inferior to those of German troops, not out of deliberate cruelty, but due to collapsing agricultural output and the demands of total war. Many Wehrmacht units believed this was simply the norm of wartime captivity, shaping their expectations of what awaited them if they fell into Allied hands. The shock upon entering an American-run facility was therefore not merely physical, it was cultural. The U.S. Army enforced Geneva Convention standards with meticulous precision. Inspections were routine. Camp commanders documented ration deliveries. Medical officers monitored prisoner nutrition. Red Cross parcels, when available, were distributed without interference. American military police were instructed to maintain discipline firmly, but without humiliation. But what struck the Germans most was the consistency. It wasn't that American meals were luxurious. They were plain military food, often repetitive and utilitarian. What stunned the prisoners was that the meals arrived on time, in full quantity, and with ingredients far beyond the imagination of a country collapsing under total war. Diaries recovered after the conflict highlight this contrast. One captured sergeant from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division wrote that he hadn't tasted real coffee since late 1943, yet received hot cups of it twice in his first week in American hands. Another soldier from the 12th SS Panzer Division remarked that the bread served in his POW camp was whiter, softer, and more plentiful than anything available to German civilians. The irony was not lost on them. The enemy, whom they had been told lived in decadence and weakness, was now feeding them better than their own nation could feed its defenders. American public opinion played a role as well. Although anger toward the Axis powers was strong, there was widespread belief that the United States must uphold international standards to maintain moral authority. Newspapers occasionally covered POW camp life, emphasizing fair treatment as proof of American values. Religious organizations and humanitarian groups urged humane policies, framing them as both ethical obligations and strategic advantages. Internally, the U.S. Army recognized another incentive. Well-fed prisoners worked better. Many German POWs were assigned to labor detachments, helping with agriculture, construction, or camp maintenance under controlled conditions. Ensuring adequate nutrition protected their performance and reduced medical complications. Reports also noted that German officers were quick to maintain discipline within their ranks when provisions were reliable, reducing the burden on American guards. Yet the most revealing aspect was how often prisoners received more reliable calories than U.S. frontline troops. This was not because prisoners were privileged. It was because frontline supply was unpredictable, especially during fast-moving operations. Infantry units advancing through Normandy, the Hürtgen Forest, or the Ardennes frequently lived on K-rations, cold canned meals, or forage food. Meanwhile, POW camps connected directly to established depots faced fewer interruptions. When supplies were tight, commanders prioritized camp stability, knowing that hungry prisoners could become a security risk. This led to situations where American guards jokingly observed that prisoners were eating better than they were. Some frontline soldiers resented it. Others saw it as a practical necessity. But for the Germans behind the wire, the message was unmistakable. America's strength was not only on the battlefield, but in its ability to sustain a massive war effort without descending into desperation. By late 1944 and early 1945, this contrast became even starker. German units retreating from the Western Front were often exhausted, ill-fed, and struggling to survive. Yet within days of capture, they found themselves receiving organized meals, medical checkups, and predictable routines. It was as if they had stepped from a collapsing world into an orderly, well-supplied system that operated with calm confidence. And it was precisely this contrast, the bleak hunger of the German winter against the steady abundance of American supply, that set the stage for the deeper, more personal reactions that unfolded inside the POW compounds. These reactions form the human core of the story, revealing how food became a quiet but powerful symbol of the war's outcome. Long before German prisoners tasted their first American meal, logistics had already shaped the war's outcome. To the United States, supply was not a secondary task. It was the foundation of military power. The Quartermaster Corps treated food, fuel, medicine, and clothing with the same seriousness as artillery or armor. From sprawling depots in Cherbourg and Antwerp to mobile field kitchens operating just miles behind the front, the U.S. system functioned with a precision that stunned even its allies. For German POWs, witnessing this system firsthand was a revelation. They came from an army constantly battling shortages, horse-drawn wagons sinking in mud, trains destroyed by Allied bombers, depots stripped bare as retreat accelerated. In contrast, American trucks arrived with clockwork regularity. Drivers logged routes, supply sergeants checked manifests, and engineers ensured roads stayed open even in hostile weather. Food was the clearest expression of this superiority. U.S. forces produced, packaged, and transported rations in quantities so immense that even major disruptions, such as the destruction of the port of Cherbourg or the Ardennes counteroffensive, failed to shut down the supply chain. At every stage, the emphasis was on surplus, not survival. For the German prisoners, this abundance felt like a different kind of battlefield defeat. The enemy's ability to feed captives so well was not an act of charity. It was a demonstration of overwhelming national strength. Each meal served behind the wire was a reminder that American logistics, not just American firepower, had tipped the balance of the war. And in the quiet of those moments, Many realized they were witnessing a supply empire far beyond anything Germany could sustain. For soldiers who had marched through scorched towns, stood in ration lines, and lived for weeks on thin soup and black bread, the American POW diet was nothing short of astonishing. Many Germans had endured months of hunger before capture. Civilians at home were surviving on limited rations, and frontline troops often scavenged for food in abandoned villages. The contrast when entering American custody was immediate and visceral. What shocked them was not luxury. Military meals were plain, but the consistency and quantity. Bread that arrived daily, not weekly. Meat that appeared in stews instead of disappearing entirely. Coffee so abundant that guards drank it by the gallon. Fresh vegetables and fruit when supply allowed. Even simple items like margarine or jam felt extravagant to prisoners who had lived through shortages since 1942. This abundance challenged deeply ingrained assumptions. Nazi propaganda had insisted the United States was decadent, weak, and disorganized. But here, in the orderly lines of a POW camp, the prisoners saw a nation capable of supplying not only its own vast armies, but its enemies as well. Hunger had been a constant element of German wartime life. The idea of an army feeding captives more consistently than its own soldiers was unthinkable. Many prisoners recorded feelings of shame, envy, confusion, or even gratitude, emotions that clashed with everything they had been taught. Some interpreted the food as a sign of American moral superiority. Others saw it as proof of industrial dominance. But for nearly all, the experience forced a re-evaluation of the world beyond the Reich, revealing a level of material stability they had never imagined. The routine of an American POW camp was simple, structured, and predictable, qualities that carried immense psychological weight after the chaos of the front. Each day began with roll call and a hot breakfast, usually oatmeal, bread, coffee, and sometimes canned fruit. Afterward, prisoners assigned to labor detachments walked under guard to nearby farms, workshops, or repair yards. Those who remained performed camp tasks, cleaning barracks, maintaining fences, or helping in the kitchen. Lunch and dinner were often served from large field kettles, with menus posted in advance. Stews, beans, potatoes, bread, meat when available, and occasional desserts formed the core diet. American officers inspected kitchens regularly, ensuring cleanliness and portion accuracy. To prevent disputes, German NCOs oversaw ration distribution within their ranks, maintaining military order under American rules. Leisure time surprised many captives. Camps included makeshift libraries, sports fields, and designated areas for crafts or music. The Red Cross provided educational materials, allowing prisoners to study languages, mathematics, or engineering. Guards enforced discipline, but harassment or humiliation was forbidden. Medical staff treated illness promptly, and dental care, rare for German enlisted men, was routinely provided. What impressed prisoners most was the sense of stability. Even in winter storms or during periods when U.S. units faced critical supply demands, the POW routine rarely faltered. Meals arrived. Work assignments continued. The camp operated with steady confidence, as though the vast war outside posed no threat to its order. Inside the barbed wire, German soldiers found a world that contradicted their expectations. Organized, humane, and supplied with a consistency unmatched on their own side. One of the quiet ironies of the Western Front was that German POWs in American custody often received meals more regular, and sometimes more substantial, than U.S. soldiers fighting only a few dozen miles away. This was not because prisoners were favored, but because frontline supply lines were the most vulnerable point in any army. In the chaos of rapid advances, muddy terrain, frozen roads, and German counterattacks, frontline troops survived on whatever could be brought forward. K-rations, canned meats, biscuits, and the occasional hot meal when a field kitchen caught up. Meanwhile, POW camps were fed from rear depots, stable, organized hubs that rarely faced disruption. So while infantrymen in foxholes ate cold beans or hard biscuits, Prisoners inside the wire received hot stews, fresh bread, or full-type rations prepared in bulk kitchens. Letters home from American soldiers mentioned this strange imbalance. "The prisoners eat better than we do," one GI wrote after the Ardennes campaign, half with irritation and half with disbelief. Camp commanders understood the logic. Hungry prisoners were unpredictable. Ensuring consistent food reduced escape attempts, maintained order, and protected guards. The Geneva Convention also required equal treatment, but equal meant the U.S. Army standard, not the hardship of field conditions. To German soldiers accustomed to their own army's priority system, where prisoners received scraps at best and frontline troops barely more, the idea that their captors would feed them consistently even while their own men fought on half rations felt surreal. It revealed a structural truth. American abundance was so vast that even a temporary imbalance tilted in favor of men who no longer carried rifles. Beyond logistics, the United States approached POW management with a legal and ethical framework uncommon during total war. American officers were trained in the Articles of the 1929 Geneva Convention and held accountable for violations. Commanders understood that the nation's international reputation and the treatment of American prisoners in German hands depended on upholding these standards. Inspections were rigorous. Ration lists were logged and reported. When shortages occurred, commanders were required to document corrective steps. Medical officers recorded caloric intake and monitored deficiencies. Red Cross visits were permitted, and parcels, when available, were distributed under supervision. Discipline was firm but not cruel. Punishment for infractions followed military procedure, not improvisation or vengeance. This contrasted sharply with the environment many German soldiers came from. The Wehrmacht, stretched thin and operating under mounting shortages, often rationed prisoners by necessity rather than policy. On the Eastern Front, conditions were catastrophic. Against Western POWs, standards varied widely depending on local commanders and supply constraints. For many German soldiers, the idea of a fully regulated, legally compliant POW system was theoretical rather than real. Thus, upon entering American custody, they encountered a process that felt almost bureaucratic in its consistency. Food was not a favor, it was an obligation. Medical care was not charity, it was routine. Even the guards, when stern, acted within clear rules. This environment had a deep psychological effect. The Germans felt watched, but not abused, controlled, but not degraded. Treatment was not friendly, but it was stable. And stability, after months of retreat and hunger, felt like a form of mercy. The quality of rations inside American POW camps rippled far beyond the war's final months. For tens of thousands of captured German soldiers, their first real introduction to the United States came not through propaganda or battlefield combat, but through a metal tray filled with food they hadn't tasted in years. The experience left an imprint that survived the war's end. When repatriated prisoners gave testimonies, many highlighted the unexpected fairness and abundance they encountered. Reports submitted to German authorities in 1947 to 48 show recurring themes. The Americans were strict but humane, food was plentiful, and life inside the camps was organized with a clarity missing in the collapsing Reich. This shaped their views of America in subtle but powerful ways. Some former POWs later credited their time in U.S. custody with exposing them to ideas of democracy, order, and economic stability. Others returned home puzzled by the sheer scale of American resources. How? They wondered, could the enemy sustain its prisoners better than Germany sustained its soldiers? These impressions influenced post-war cooperation. Many veterans who later worked in reconstruction efforts or participated in the new West German military recalled their captivity as evidence that the United States was a reliable partner. Even those who had no admiration for American culture acknowledged the logistical strength they had witnessed firsthand. Food, simple, routine, unremarkable to Americans, became a quiet ambassador. It turned the POW experience into a bridge rather than a wound, showing defeated soldiers a version of America defined not by bombs or tanks, but by order, capacity, and restrained power. By late December 1944, the Western Front had reached its most chaotic and uncertain moment. The German Ardennes offensive, what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge, had shattered American expectations, torn through thin defensive lines, and plunged thousands of soldiers into one of the coldest winters Europe had seen in decades. Supplies stalled. Roads froze. American units were cut off, hungry, and exhausted. Fuel shortages crippled armored divisions, and artillery units rationed shells with painful precision. Yet only a few miles behind the turbulent front, the contrast inside American-controlled POW enclosures grew more striking with each passing day. On December 22, 1944, as U.S. infantry at Bastogne survived on cold rations and melted snow, a newly captured group of German prisoners arrived at a temporary camp near Spa. These men, many from the 560th Volksgrenadier Division, were freezing, hollow-eyed, and running on barely 1,200 calories a day before their capture. Their boots were worn through. Their greatcoats were patched with scavenged cloth. Several had not eaten a hot meal in over a week. Their arrival coincided with one of the most difficult supply periods for American frontline troops. The Red Ball Express had been disrupted. Ammunition took priority over food. Some U.S. units reported receiving only a fraction of their scheduled rations. Yet the POW camp, drawing from a more stable rear depot, operated like a different world. When the Germans were marched to the camp kitchen for processing, they saw steam rising from large kettles of hot stew, beans, pork, potatoes, prepared hours earlier. A supply sergeant unloaded crates of bread loaves thick enough to serve entire squads. A medical officer documented that the prisoners would be placed on a 3,000-calorie diet to restore strength for labor assignments once medically cleared. The reaction among the newly captured soldiers was immediate and visible. Many stared in disbelief. One young prisoner, barely 20 years old, whispered to his comrade that he had not seen this much food in a single place since 1942. Another asked the guard, cautiously and in broken English, if the meal was truly intended for prisoners. The guard nodded without interest, routine for him, astonishing for them. The moment that encapsulated the turning point occurred 2 days later. On December 24th, the camp served its scheduled meal, unaffected by the surrounding chaos. American units in the Ardennes were enduring their harshest days of the war, fighting in forests where temperatures dropped far below freezing, where rations froze inside tins and had to be thawed under jackets. Some units fought for 48 hours without a chance to heat food. Others survived on chocolate bars or whatever they had saved from earlier days. Meanwhile, inside the camp, prisoners formed orderly lines as the cooks ladled out a Christmas Eve meal. It was simple: beef stew, white bread, margarine, a small ration of canned peaches, and hot coffee. Yet to hungry men from a collapsing army, it was overwhelming, almost surreal. A German officer, formerly of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, later recounted that he looked at the American guards, cold, tired, eating quickly from their belts' rations, and realized that he, the prisoner, was receiving a warmer and more plentiful meal than the armed men responsible for keeping him behind the wire. This moment spread through the camp like whispered news, and as word reached new arrivals from different units, the psychological impact deepened. These men had been taught that the American soldier was soft, undisciplined, reliant on machines and luxuries. But here, in the heart of winter, the Americans were fighting bitter battles with minimal comfort, while still providing predictable meals to their prisoners. To the Germans, this suggested something far more profound than generosity. It pointed to a national strength so vast that even battlefield setbacks could not shake the efficiency of its supply system. The turning point reached its peak in early January 1945. As the German offensive faltered, more prisoners arrived, thousands captured in counterattacks around Roquefort, Marquet, and Hatton. They came thin, pale, and unprepared for the cold. Yet within days, many found themselves standing in lines for hot food, medical checks, and organized shelter. That steady rhythm, unchanged by the violence raging just miles away, revealed a decisive truth. While German soldiers fought with dwindling resources, the Americans possessed not only numerical and industrial superiority, but a logistical discipline powerful enough to care for enemy soldiers during one of the most brutal battles of the war. Inside the camp fences, as the war's tide turned decisively, the Germans began to understand that they were not merely defeated on the battlefield. They had been defeated by a system, and that realization, quiet, undeniable, forms the heart of the climax. By early January 1945, the bitter cold had settled into a permanent presence across the Ardennes. Snow drifted in thick sheets over the shattered forests, muffling artillery fire and slowing every movement to a crawl. American divisions, tired, underfed, and operating on dangerously stretched supply lines, continued fighting to push the Germans back. Yet only a short distance behind those frozen lines, the American POW camps moved with a steady, almost indifferent consistency. To the German prisoners inside, this consistency became impossible to ignore. On January 3rd, just after dusk, a group of recently captured soldiers from the 9th Panzer Division arrived at a sprawling temporary camp outside Malmedy. They were in terrible condition, sleep-deprived, hungry, and shaken. Many had expected brutal treatment. Some feared retaliation because of the Malmedy massacre only weeks earlier. They entered the enclosure tents, prepared for the worst. But what they found was something none of them anticipated. A sergeant from the U.S. 99th Infantry Division supervised their arrival, checking manifests and directing them toward the processing line. The Americans spoke firmly, but without malice. They confiscated weapons, recorded identification data, and sent the new prisoners to a barracks tent warmed by a diesel stove. But the most striking moment came when one of the guards, seeing a prisoner shivering uncontrollably, took the man's arm and quietly said, "Mess tent's open. Get some food first." Inside the tent, kettles of stew simmered next, to stacks of army bread and cans of fruit. The Americans served coffee, hot, strong, and replenished constantly, to exhausted men emerging from days of combat and starvation. It was a shock so profound that some later described it as surreal. The difference between the world inside the wire and the battlefield beyond, it was staggering. Only hours earlier, many of these same Americans had been fighting in forests where temperatures reached 20 degrees below freezing. Frostbite cases had spiked. Soldiers reported that their sea rations froze solid, forcing them to break open tins with bayonets. In some units, men had gone 2 days without a hot meal because fuel dumps were destroyed or inaccessible. Yet every morning and evening, the camp cooks ensured that prisoners, not soldiers, received predictable, warm food. This contrast spread through the prisoner population like a revelation. One night, a 30-year-old German sergeant named Karl Reinhardt, captured near La Roche, sat near the stove and whispered to the man beside him, "Our army is starving while there's feeds even us. What chance did we ever have?" It was not despair he voiced, but something deeper, recognition. The turning point reached an emotional summit on January 7th. A violent snowstorm swept across the region, paralyzing supply routes and grounding aircraft. American frontline units dug into icy positions, surviving on cold rations and whatever they had in their pockets. A platoon near Hofelize reported eating only chocolate and crackers that day. Some men melted snow to drink. But the POW camp kitchens did not stop. A single supply truck arrived late, sliding across ice, engine coughing in the cold, and brought enough food to keep the camp running at full capacity. The prisoners lined up, stamping their boots to stay warm, as the cooks ladled out steaming stew and handed each man a thick slice of bread. A captured lieutenant, formerly of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, stared at the food for several seconds before finally saying, "This is madness. They are treating us better than their own." The American guard behind him shrugged. "Orders," he said. That word, orders, echoed among the prisoners. Not kindness, not charity, but institutional expectation. a system that functioned even when exhausted soldiers were freezing and fighting only miles away. The sheer reliability of the American supply structure became a symbol of something far larger than food. To many prisoners, it explained the entire war. The Reich had rallied its people through sacrifice and hardship, urging them to endure shortages and hunger for the fatherland. But here, the Americans, wealthy, industrialized, efficient, could fight a massive offensive, recover from surprise, supply their troops, and still feed thousands of enemy soldiers without faltering. For the German prisoners, this revelation was devastating. It dismantled years of propaganda. It exposed the enormous gap between their own system, collapsing, overextended, and starving, and the American machine that operated with almost mechanical predictability. By mid-January, as the snowstorm lifted and the Allies regained momentum, the psychological shift within the camps was undeniable. Prisoners who had arrived angry or fearful now spent hours quietly discussing what they had witnessed. They questioned their old beliefs. They debated Germany's future. And some, for the first time, admitted openly that the war was not only lost on the battlefield, it had been lost in the factories, on the railroads, and at the supply depots years before. In the bitter winter of 1945, among tents warmed by diesel stoves and guarded by hungry soldiers, the German prisoners experienced the moment that marked the true climax of their understanding. They had been defeated not merely by an enemy army. They had been defeated by an entire way of organizing a nation.